This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It is Saturday, June 27th, 2026. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio. Good to be back. Just a quick update on the Protect Girls Sports issue. As some of you may know, I am definitely invested in the referendum that was led by the Maine Girl Dads to collect over 67,000 signatures to exercise Maine voters' rights under our Constitution to initiate legislation. And the legislation that the Protect Girls Sports group wants to initiate and put on the ballot to see if other Maine voters agree in the upcoming November election is whether to separate athletics in Maine schools on the basis of sex. Athletics and private spaces such as locker rooms and bathrooms. Um, really simple, getting back to a system that worked for, I don't know, decades since Title IX was implicated. We always had facilities separated on the basis of sex as well as athletic teams. That is what enabled women and girls to have athletic opportunities to compete fairly and to have achievements and medals and accolades and scholarships. Well, as you know, as I've mentioned a few hundred times, in Maine, we, meaning the legislature, snuck into our Human Rights Act gender identity as a protected status in 2019, and the definition of gender identity says it's your deep-seated, sincere beliefs, regardless of sex. So essentially, what adopting gender identity did in our law was eliminate sex-based rights. And so what this referendum did, what hopes to do, is to reestablish the rule that separates athletics on the basis of sex, which is very fair because everybody has a sex, everybody's born with a sex. And, as a little primer, humans are mammals. There's two sexes, male and female. Other mammals in Maine law are recognized, as being separated by males and females. Female lobsters, for instance, get thrown back, a little notch on their tail. Female pheasants get certain protections, female dogs, of course. And up until just 2019, female humans, that's what women are. We're adult female humans. That's really the definition of women. Well, in 2019, when the Maine legislature snuck this definition of gender identity into the Human Rights Act that made sex irrelevant, then suddenly there was no boundaries between men and women. And boys could identify as a girl and have the right to play on girls' sports teams. And in Maine, that's meant girls losing out on state championships. It means boys in girls' locker rooms. It means, you know, several women and girls discriminated against on the basis of their sex. And so the Maine Girl Dads organized a referendum initiative, collected over 67,000 signatures, above and beyond the requisite number. According to the Constitution, if you want to initiate legislation, you have to collect at least 10% of the number of voters who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So, you look in the previous gubernatorial election, how many people went out to the polls, 10% of that number. You have to get that number of signatures of registered voters. So there's no doubt that the requisite number of eligible voters signed a petition to exercise our rights under the Constitution to initiate legislation. But what's holding things up is there was one circulator, and the circulator is the person who has the petition, and collects the signatures, and then afterwards attests to the fact that they were present, that they followed the rules, that the people signed the signatures, and that they believe them to be, valid. I'm summarizing. But the circulator is the person responsible for the collection of the signatures. This one circulator, Cairo, okay, she was a very good signature gatherer. She was a good circulator. She was a successful circulator in the sense that she collected a lot of signatures. However, despite the fact that every single person who signed Cairo's petition were registered voters and their signatures valid, and that these people, wanted to engage in this activity of trying to initiate legislation. On the petition itself, when Cairo went to sign as the circulator, she attested to, I swear that I followed the law, that I did everything that I think I was supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'm paraphrasing. And she signed under oath. But what she did, there was one section that you were supposed to check a box whether you're either a Maine resident or a non-Maine resident who's willing to submit to the jurisdiction of the courts. So because she was unclear, she had actually had quite a lot of experience as a circulator, and this had never presented itself before. This box about checking whether you're a resident or you would submit to the jurisdiction. So because she was unclear, she didn't check one of the boxes, but when she found out later what it meant and that it was important, she checked the box. And most importantly, when there was actually a hearing, because there was a challenge to the number of signatures, when there was a hearing, uh, nobody questioned Cairo's, petition signatures. And Cairo showed up. She submitted to this jurisdiction of Maine at the hearing and gave full and free testimony, was available for cross-examination. None of the signatures that she collected were deemed invalid. It was only later the opponents who were trying to kill this referendum made an issue of the fact that Cairo checked this box too late. So that's the issue on that's holding up the referendum. Um, and if in fact the referendum does not go out to the voters in November, it will be a shame. But the purpose of this podcast is to just alert you to my minor role, but very exciting. Um, the briefs in the case were due on Monday, and I had the privilege and honor of submitting an amicus brief or an amici brief, plural, friend of the court brief on behalf of not the parties to the litigation, but people who signed the petition. 3 people who signed the petition and 1 person who circulated a petition herself and collected 162 signatures. They weighed in about how this technical hangup now that the Secretary of State introduced late in the game, right after saying that the referendum was valid and allowing it to go out to the voters. Then there was a challenge in court. Then the Secretary backtracked and found this excuse. So these people are making the case, and I submitted the brief arguing that, like, this is disenfranchisement of voters, of our rights as electors under the Constitution to initiate legislation. And it's not fair that these valid signatures of, in the instance, 2 people signed Cairo's petition, and they're registered voters. They wanted to sign the petition. Their petition signatures are valid. But because Cairo didn't check that box, their signatures were invalidated, no fault of their own. There was another person whose signature was not invalidated on Cairo's petition. Her signature was validated, but because the referendum's not going out for this technical reason, she objects because she's, I want this citizens petition to go out to the voters. That's why we collected all these signatures. And again, no one disputes that there's the actual number of requisite signatures. There's no dispute that enough people who are registered voters signed petitions. The dispute is just over whether or not Cairo checking this box about submitting to jurisdiction is, it makes the whole thing invalid. That's the question for the court. And so the 2 that got invalidated, the one that whose wasn't invalidated, and then the 4th person who I filed a brief on their behalf was a circulator of a petition who, worked hard to collect 162 signatures because she wants the referendum to go out to the voters, and all that work for naught because of this technical hangup. So I submitted the brief on their behalf. The briefs were due on Monday. The oral argument, which I believe is open to the public, but also, I believe will be available to listen to online. That's going to be held on July 1st at 10 o'clock. So I'll certainly be there with my clients, my friends of the court, who I'm grateful for their efforts. I personally, in this legal proceeding, I acted as an attorney submitting the brief. But as a personal matter, I also signed the petition and I collected signatures as a circulator. So I have a vested interest in this referendum. I think it should go out to the voters. I mean, this is an issue we have never, as a community in the state of Maine, had a public debate about the merits of gender identity laws. They were just shoved down our throat in a very unfair process. And now we're left like picking up the pieces of this train wreck. And why not let this issue? It's very simple legislation. Like I said, it's very fair. Every student who registers for Maine schools has to provide a birth certificate. And on that student's birth certificate is their sex. And their sex is not a random assignment that was made, willy-nilly when they were born. It was an actual scientific observation of their biological sex. And that marker on their birth certificate is easy enough for schools to use as a resource in separating athletics on the basis of sex. Everybody has a sex, everybody can play on the team of their sex. It's fair. It's fair. It's fair to the girls, it's fair to the boys. And despite the media insistence on saying that somehow this referendum is anti-trans and that this referendum would ban trans athletes on girls' sports teams. No, because keep in mind that this trans mania that these students have been brainwashed with, I think, but even legitimate cases of gender dysphoria among children, there is both girls and boys who have gender dysphoria. So if you're a girl and you have gender dysphoria, you identify as a boy, you would still play on the girls' team. So there's trans athletes are not banned from the girls' teams because girls who identify as boys would play on the girls' team, and boys who identify as girls would play on the boys' team. All students, regardless of their gender identity, would be separated on the basis of sex and locker rooms and bathrooms for obvious reasons. For obvious reasons. Now, if there's a student who has gender dysphoria who needs a reasonable accommodation to use a bathroom or a locker room to meet his or her needs, and it's reasonable, balancing the interests of the student and the other students, well, of course, those accommodations should be made. But this law now, the gender identity law now, is that any boy at any time can identify as a girl or even just have a gender identity and say, I want access to this bathroom. I demand access to this bathroom. And they get it. And they can demand access to teams and locker rooms and all kinds of things that we just, you know, it's not unfair or unreasonable to ask Maine voters to weigh in. I hope you'll all weigh in. And if the referendum gets on the ballot in November, it's certainly going to, I think, shake up the race because let's talk about now. We'll shift into, I haven't had a podcast for a bit, but there's a lot been happening. Obviously, the primaries finally were tallied. And we know the winners on the Democratic side, Hannah Pingree, which I'm glad about, of all the Democratic candidates. She's my favorite. And of course, on the Republican side, Bobby Charles, who was not my favorite, to be honest. I voted in the Republican primary, and I did rank Bobby Charles. And I don't think poorly of him. He just wasn't my top three. And so now, we're going to have a race in Maine of a Democrat, a Republican, and a so-called independent Rick Bennett. And I'm just not sure what I'm going to do. I'm going to see what happens because I see Hannah Pingree and Bobby Charles both played to their bases, right? Of course, in a primary, and they did it successfully because they both won. But in playing to their bases, they sort of turned me off. Hannah, with her refusal, I think, to acknowledge the Democrats' complicity in the erasure of protections of women and girls' rights. It's just astonishing to me that there's just like a block there that the Democrats don't see the harm that's been done. So it really bothers me that the Democratic Party wants to change the Maine Constitution, okay, to add gender identity as a constitutionally protected status. That means women and girls no longer exist. There is nothing to separate women from men, and we no longer will have protections on the basis of sex. We will no longer be like just recognized. It's an existential threat to the reality of the female sex. And the fact that the Democrats want to, having done all this damage, right, with all these laws, I've got this stack of laws where gender identity was inserted in places that just cause harm. They want to now put that in the Constitution? Well, I wanna see if Hannah Pingree is gonna move a little bit on that issue. And Bobby Charles, he played to his base, the MAGA kinda Trump rhetoric, which, I'm not big on, you know? I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I had hoped he would succeed. He's not succeeding. There's nothing good about the Trump presidency right now except for the fact that they take a position that I agree with when it comes to women's sex-based rights, and that's not a small thing. That's a big thing. Um, so, I mean, when it comes to the governor's race, I mean, stay tuned, right? I don't know, is Rick Bennett gonna draw more from the left or the right or maybe the center? I don't know. He was a Republican senator. He was the chairman of the Republican Party. I think he was a national delegate to Republican conventions. But, I used to be a Democrat, right? I won the primary in 2012 against Matt Dunlap. Okay, that's how things change. So I was a Democratic state representative, a Democratic state senator. I ran for the US Senate. I won a Democratic primary, and now I am not a Democrat because the Democrats no longer believe in the reality of women. And I think their housing policies stink, and I think the healthcare policy stinks. I think they're just too big. It's so much government. It's in Maine, the bureaucracy is just stunningly strong um and it's dangerous. And so I think Maine needs a change, but I'm not sure who I'm voting for in the gubernatorial race yet. So let's um let's stay together on this one. But I'm definitely not voting like for Graham Platner. And he came out lately as, I mean, he's got his shtick, right, that he's like an oyster farmer, which is complete BS as far as I'm concerned. Uh, but him taking on the cloak of, like, working class warrior is particularly hypocritical because, in my view, I mean, maybe I'm old-fashioned, okay? Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think if you claim to be a working class champion, you should have a job. You should work a little bit, and Graham Plattner, let's face it, he doesn't. He has an oyster farm that, like, the website was created after the DC consultants asked him if he wanted to run for United States Senate. Okay, I'm not making this up. Go look at the interview of Graham Platner and John, oh my God, the comedian, Jon Stewart. Okay, Graham Platner says, "Yeah, these DC consultants came up and said that they saw a video of me protesting a salmon farm, and they were like, 'Hey, dude, you should run for US Senate.' And I was like," this is Graham Platner talking, "'Fuck no, man, that's crazy. But then, here I am.'" So then after the DC consultants come up and ask Graham Platner if he wants to run for US Senate, and he decides to, well, yeah, sure, I have nothing else going on, right? Uh, he decides, and then all of a sudden he gets this like flashy oyster farm oyster farmer brand. But the devil's in the details. And when he made his disclosure to the federal government in his campaign documentation, he disclosed that he earns no income, and his only client that like he had more than $5,000 worth of business with in a year was his mother. So, I mean, you can have a lemonade stand in your parents' driveway for a living. But, that doesn't make you a Cracker Jack entrepreneur necessarily. So, for Graham Platner to be like working man's hero, I mean, the guy, he didn't finish college. He went off to 2 wars to kill people, and then now, in retrospect, doesn't think those wars were a good idea, and they're Susan Collins' fault. You know, he roughs up his girlfriends and cheats on his wife. He doesn't know he has a Nazi tattoo. I mean, so I hey, Democrats, I know you have Trump derangement syndrome. I get it. I mean, there are people who are so crazed about Trump, and I understand. I mean, it's enough to just drive you mad. I mean, the guy is, you know, but Trump's not on the ballot. Okay, it's not Trump in 2028. It's or 2026 rather. It's Susan Collins and Graham Platner. Okay, Susan Collins, who didn't vote for Trump twice, okay, who voted to convict Trump in the United States Senate. Okay, she's not the Trump enabler. You can say, oh, she votes with Trump 94% of the time. Yeah, that 6% of the time that she doesn't vote with Trump, that's a lot, considering that she is a Republican and, and like she's chair of the Appropriations Committee and Trump like opposed her and she won anyway. So I Democrats and Graham Platner, I hope you figure it out. But this idea that somehow this guy, Graham Platner, is the champion of workers or the champion of women, the Democratic Party has, like, the ship has sailed. They do not support the rights of women. Okay, maybe that sounds like a surprise to you. But, Republicans, the ones who really ended slavery, and the Republicans, the ones who brought the Civil Rights Act over the finish line. And it's going to be the Republicans who are going to save the female sex in American society from the Democrats who want to run candidates like Graham Platner. Instead of a competent woman, we're going to vote for this boorish man. Yeah, no, there's like echoes of Bernie Sanders, the Sanders bros who were so misogynist. Like I'm sure they voted for Trump after they, tried to take down Hillary. And, so the Democrats, we'll see. We'll see what happens in 2026. My money is on Susan Collins, but the most disgusting thing, the absolute worst disgusting thing is that win or lose, Graham Platner is going to be a millionaire because of suckers on the left who are going to keep sending him money because they get these things on their like phone. Send $5, send $10. So just like Sarah Gideon, who I have a lot of respect for. Okay, Graham Platner, I do not, but both of them run for U.S. Senate, lose, and then sit on a war chest. So all this talk by Graham Platner about oligarchs and millionaires and billionaires and the rich paying their fair share, at the end of this game that he's playing with your money, he's going to be a millionaire. And what do you think he's going to do with that money? I doubt he's going to be donating it to, the hungry kids, on the streets of Lewiston. No, I kind of doubt that there's really going to be any good done with that money. And so this whole Graham Platner thing is just so disgusting on so many levels. And this is what the Democrats offer. And it's like somehow they're zombies. They're the Stepford wives with Trump derangement syndrome. Just backing Platner. Well, they're going to lose. Okay, I guess that's it. Oh, no, that's not it. I did get the Freedom of Access Act request that I had sent to the Maine Human Rights Commission. I did get the response, and as I suspected, before gender identity was added into the Maine Human Rights Act as a protected status, there was not a single, not one, meritorious claim of discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So this whole argument that we get that there's this marginalized community that we need to protect with these laws. Well, it's such a marginalized community, it doesn't even exist. The real marginalized community in all of this gender ideology, it's not some kids who are staring at their navel, trying to figure out the disassociation between their body and soul that their parents keep telling them is probably their problem. No, it's, I mean, when push comes to shove, what we're really talking about here is really just the top 1% of the elite men in society. That's who got together, or not just men, but the marginalized group, in other words, that is responsible for gender identity laws is not a marginalized group that's been discriminated against. It's the very upper echelons of the Democratic Party. And in the case in Maine, we had the very, famous Mary Bonato meeting in closed doors with the Equality Maine and majority leaders of the Democratic Party and the lawyer for the Maine Human Rights Commission. And they all met and choreographed how they're going to get this gender identity definition through the process in a very deceitful way, and that is by presenting to the Judiciary Committee that this definition is just a clarification, and when really it was an earth-shattering change in the rights of women because it suddenly makes sex irrelevant. So I guess the question, and now we know because I did this freedom of access request that there was no legitimate claims. So there was not a single personal story calling out for a change in the law. It was just these upper echelon elitists from the left who and they did this, and let's face it, Mary Bonato, she's a lot smarter than I am, right? Okay. She knew that expanding the definition of gender identity to make sex irrelevant would be pretty significant change in the legal landscape, right? Of course she knew. She's the one who won the Obergefell case at the Supreme Court. Okay, so here she is in a closed, in a meeting, right, with no public there, no representatives of women's rights, nobody looking out for women and girls. So here she is in this closed door meeting with lawmakers and convinces the lawyer for the Maine Human Rights Commission to just lie and say that this is just a clarification of the law. Either she knew or she didn't know, but I have a feeling Mary Bonato knew, and I have a feeling that, like, she knew what she was doing, and, um, and the Equality Maine people knew what they were doing, and the Maine Human Rights Commission didn't. And so, it's a shame that this happened because, like I said, there was no marginalized group of people being discriminated against that led us to this nightmare that we're in right now, where we have a gender identity law that says men can enter spaces whenever they say so. Men can be in women's prisons, men can be in women's shelters, men can be in women's bathrooms. And, I'm sorry, it's not just men with gender dysphoria. Any man, whether you're a predator, whether you're an autogynephile, okay, there's a lot of men with kinky fetishes who now, because of gender identity laws, we have to accept this deviant behavior as a so-called expression of gender, that they're somehow identifying as a woman. It's offensive to me as a woman. Okay, all these drag queens suddenly, they're in woman face, like, they're not identifying as women. No women I know act or look like that, and it's not fair to women to suddenly say every guy who has some kinky fetish who's in the graveyard at night, yeah, Gia Drew, I'm looking at you, dressed up like a porn star, like, you're identifying as a woman? No, I'm sorry, you're not. You're just a man with a mental disorder who now, because of gender identity laws, uh, gets to invade women's spaces. So, we gotta clean up the gender identity laws. We gotta elect Susan Collins back to the United States Senate. We gotta put the Protect Girls Sports referendum on the ballot. And until next time, this is Cynthia Dill signing off. Take care.